The first thing Brandon noticed was that Max had dragged Vanessa's suitcase back into the apartment by the handle and shoved it against the front door like he was trying to stop her from leaving. The golden retriever stood there trembling, paws planted wide on the hardwood floor, staring directly at Vanessa with a low sound in his throat Brandon had never heard before. Not barking, not growling, something deeper, something uneasy. "See," Vanessa snapped as she yanked the suitcase away. "Your dog is seriously starting to scare me." Brandon looked down in disbelief. Max had lived with him for almost 5 years, and in all that time, the dog had never acted aggressively toward anyone. Not the mailman, not loud neighbors, not even the drunk guy who once stumbled into Brandon's yard at 2 in the morning. Max was the kind of dog strangers stopped to pet at the park. Kids climbed all over him. Elderly women called him an angel. But lately, every time Vanessa came near the apartment door, Max reacted like something was wrong. Brandon forced a laugh, trying to kill the tension hanging in the room. "He probably just doesn't want you to leave yet." But Max didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Vanessa's purse sitting on the kitchen counter. The dog's ears flattened slowly. Then, without warning, he walked forward and placed himself directly between Brandon and Vanessa. Vanessa's expression hardened instantly. "Okay, now, I'm done pretending this is normal." Outside, rain hammered against the apartment windows while distant thunder rolled across downtown Seattle. Brandon rubbed the back of his neck, exhausted after a 10-hour shift at the auto shop. The last thing he wanted was another argument. For the past month, every conversation with Vanessa somehow circled back to Max. The shedding, the barking, the smell, the way Brandon always checked on the dog first when he got home. At first, he thought it was just adjustment stress from moving in together. But recently, the complaints had started feeling sharper, more personal. "You baby that dog more than you care about us," Vanessa muttered, crossing her arms. Brandon opened his mouth to respond, but Max suddenly spun around and bolted toward the hallway. Seconds later, Brandon heard the sound of scratching. Fast, aggressive. He turned the corner and froze. Max was clawing at Brandon's office door so hard the frame rattled. "What is wrong with him tonight?" Vanessa whispered behind him, her voice quieter now. Brandon frowned. His office was usually locked because that's where he kept paperwork, tools, and his old laptop. Max never went near it. Not once. But tonight, the dog looked frantic. Brandon stepped closer. "Max, hey, stop." The dog ignored him completely. Then Brandon noticed something else. The office door wasn't fully shut anymore. It was slightly open, maybe 2 inches. And the light inside was on. Brandon's stomach tightened. He distinctly remembered turning that light off before work. Max suddenly stopped scratching. The apartment fell silent except for the rain outside. Then the dog slowly backed away from the door and looked up at Brandon with wide, nervous eyes, almost like he was waiting for him to see something. Behind them, Vanessa's voice came out strained and shaky. "Brandon, I thought you said nobody else had keys to this place." Brandon slowly pushed the office door open while Max remained frozen behind him, his claws clicking nervously against the hardwood floor. The room looked untouched at first glance. The desk lamp cast a warm yellow glow across scattered invoices and unopened mail. His laptop sat exactly where he had left it beside an empty coffee mug. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing looked broken. But something still felt wrong. Brandon stepped farther inside, scanning the room carefully while Vanessa lingered near the hallway entrance with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Maybe you forgot to turn the light off," she said quietly, though her voice carried an uneasy edge. Brandon wanted to believe that. He really did. Lately his mind had been stretched thin between overtime shifts, bills, and trying to keep peace inside the apartment. But Max's behavior would not let him relax. The dog remained low to the floor, staring at the office trash can in the corner like it contained something dangerous. Brandon crouched beside him and gently touched his neck. Max flinched. That hurt more than Brandon expected. Ever since adopting him from a crowded shelter outside Tacoma, Max had always leaned into his hand instantly. 5 years earlier, Brandon had found the skinny golden retriever curled alone in the back of a kennel with a faded blue bandana tied around his neck. The shelter worker warned him the dog barely ate and refused to interact with people after being returned twice by previous owners. But the moment Brandon sat beside the kennel floor, Max had quietly walked over and rested his head on Brandon's knee. From that day on, they became inseparable. Through layoffs, breakups, panic attacks, and lonely nights inside tiny apartments. Max had been there for all of it. Brandon used to joke that the dog knew his moods better than most people did. On nights when Brandon could not sleep, Max would drag his blanket beside the couch and stay awake with him until sunrise. When Brandon worked double shifts at the repair shop, Max waited by the front window every evening at exactly 6:30, tail thumping against the wall the second Brandon's truck pulled into the parking lot. But over the last few weeks, something inside the dog had changed. Max barely touched his food anymore unless Brandon sat beside him. He no longer slept in the bedroom and instead curled near the apartment entrance every night as if guarding it. Sometimes Brandon woke up around 3 in the morning and found Max staring silently toward the hallway with his ears twitching at sounds nobody else seemed to hear. Vanessa insisted the behavior proved the dog was becoming unstable. Brandon kept telling himself it was stress from the move. Yet deep down, he knew Max was not acting angry. He was acting afraid. Brandon glanced around the office one more time before kneeling near the trash can Max had been watching. Crumpled receipts filled most of it along with an empty takeout container and shredded paper towels. Nothing unusual. Still, Max would not stop staring at it. Brandon reached inside and lifted the trash bag slightly. Beneath it, wedged near the bottom, sat a small silver key Brandon had never seen before. His stomach tightened instantly. It definitely did not belong to him. "What is that?" Vanessa asked from behind him. Brandon held up the key slowly while Max released a soft whine that almost sounded relieved. Then Brandon noticed something else. Attached to the keychain was a tiny white tag with black marker writing on it. Apartment 3B. Brandon lived in apartment 4B. Brandon could not stop thinking about the key the next morning. Even during his shift at the repair shop, the image of the tiny white tag marked 3B kept replaying in his mind. Apartment 3B sat directly below his unit, occupied by an older man named Leonard who barely spoke to anyone in the building. Brandon had lived there almost 2 years and had only exchanged maybe 3 conversations with him total. None of it made sense. Why would a strange key connected to Leonard's apartment end up hidden in Brandon's office trash can? And why had Max been so desperate to lead him to it? By the time Brandon returned home that evening, a cold drizzle coated the city streets and the apartment building smelled faintly of wet concrete and cigarette smoke. The second he opened the front door, Max rushed toward him so quickly his paws slipped across the hardwood floor. But instead of greeting Brandon normally, the dog grabbed the sleeve of Brandon's hoodie gently between his teeth and started pulling him toward the kitchen. "What now?" Brandon muttered tiredly. Max released the sleeve and immediately began nudging Brandon's phone off the counter with his nose. The phone buzzed at that exact moment with a text message from Vanessa saying she would be home late again. Max instantly backed away from the phone and let out a strange chuffing sound deep in his chest. Not aggressive, nervous. Brandon stared at him uneasily. Over the next several days, the behavior only became stranger. Anytime Vanessa called, Max would abruptly leave the room and sit facing the apartment door. Whenever Brandon picked up his laptop, Max circled the coffee table repeatedly like he was searching for something hidden beneath it. One afternoon, Brandon caught the dog carrying Vanessa's scarf into the bathroom and dropping it into the bathtub before pacing anxiously beside it. Vanessa finally lost her patience. "This is exactly what I am talking about," she snapped while yanking the scarf away. Something is seriously wrong with him. Brandon wanted to defend Max, but even he was starting to feel unsettled. The dog no longer acted like himself. At night, Max wandered silently through the apartment instead of sleeping. Twice Brandon woke up to the sound of cabinet doors creaking open in the kitchen. Both times he found Max sitting perfectly still in the darkness, staring toward the hallway leading to the office. Then came Thursday night. Brandon had just finished showering when he heard Vanessa scream from the living room. He ran out instantly, water still dripping from his hair. Max stood on the couch with his front paws pressed against Vanessa's purse while papers, makeup, and loose receipts lay scattered across the carpet. "He went crazy," Vanessa shouted. "He literally attacked my bag." Max ignored her completely. His nose moved frantically through the spilled items until suddenly he froze. Then, very carefully, he pulled a folded receipt from beneath the purse flap and carried it straight to Brandon. Brandon took it automatically, confused. It was from a storage facility across town. Unit 214. Paid in cash 3 days earlier. Vanessa's face immediately changed the second Brandon looked down at it. "That is old," she said too quickly. "I forgot that was even there." Max began whining softly while staring at Brandon with desperate eyes. Brandon had never seen the dog behave like this over a piece of paper before. Vanessa stormed off toward the bedroom in frustration, muttering under her breath about shelters and trainers and dangerous animals. A few minutes later, the apartment suddenly went silent. Too silent. Brandon looked around the living room. Max was gone. Then he heard it. The faint metallic sound of keys jingling downstairs in the hallway outside apartment 3B. And somewhere below them, Max started barking louder than Brandon had ever heard in his life. Brandon rushed downstairs 2 steps at a time with Max charging ahead of him, the dog's barking echoing through the narrow apartment hallway loud enough to wake half the building. By the time Brandon reached the 3rd-floor landing, Leonard's apartment door was cracked open a few inches. Max stood frozen outside it, barking directly into the dark gap while scratching desperately at the carpet. "Max, stop!" Brandon grabbed the dog's collar, embarrassed and confused, but Max resisted harder than ever before. Leonard suddenly appeared behind the door looking pale and irritated in a wrinkled gray sweatshirt. "Control your dog," he snapped sharply. "He has been acting insane for days." Brandon apologized immediately, dragging Max backward while neighbors began peeking into the hallway. The humiliation burned through him. Max had never caused scenes like this before. But what unsettled Brandon most was the fear in Leonard's eyes. It was not annoyance. It looked deeper, nervous. As Brandon finally pulled Max back upstairs, the dog twisted repeatedly, trying to look behind him toward apartment 3B. The second they got inside, Vanessa exploded. "That is it. I cannot do this anymore." Brandon stared at her in disbelief while Max paced anxiously near the front window. "You saw him," Vanessa continued. "He is getting worse every single day. First my purse, then the office. Now he is terrorizing neighbors in the middle of the night." Brandon opened his mouth to defend the dog, but the words felt weaker now. The truth was, he was exhausted. Every night had become tension, barking, scratching, and arguments. He barely slept anymore. At work, he caught himself zoning out while repairing engines because he kept replaying Max's strange behavior in his head. Even his manager had asked if everything was okay. Vanessa stepped closer, her eyes softer now, almost pleading. "Brandon, I know you love him. I get it. But this is not healthy anymore. He growls at me. He destroys things. He acts obsessed with random objects and apartments. What if he snaps one day?" That question stayed lodged inside Brandon's chest long after she said it, because part of him had quietly started wondering the same thing. Later that evening, Brandon tried taking Max on a long walk through the neighborhood, hoping it would calm him down. Rainwater shimmered across the sidewalks, beneath the streetlights while traffic hissed through wet intersections nearby. Usually walks relaxed Max instantly. Tonight the dog barely noticed the outside world. Halfway through the walk, Max suddenly stopped in front of a small family diner and stared through the window. Brandon followed his gaze. Inside sat Vanessa laughing across a booth from a man Brandon had never seen before. Max released a low, uneasy whine and backed away from the glass. Brandon frowned. Maybe it was a coworker. Maybe it meant nothing. But before Brandon could think further, Vanessa glanced toward the window and immediately looked startled. She grabbed her purse quickly and turned her body away from the man. Brandon's stomach twisted uncomfortably. Yet before he could process the moment, Max began pulling hard toward the parking lot behind the diner. "No." Brandon snapped firmly for the first time in days. "Enough." Max refused to stop. The dog kept straining against the leash while staring toward a black SUV parked near the alley. Brandon finally lost his patience. "What is wrong with you lately?" he shouted loudly enough that nearby pedestrians turned their heads. Max instantly froze. The dog slowly lowered himself to the wet pavement and avoided Brandon's eyes completely. The sight hit Brandon harder than he expected. Max looked devastated. Not stubborn, not aggressive, heartbroken. But upstairs later that night, Vanessa sat beside Brandon on the couch holding his hand gently while Max remained alone near the hallway. "I think you need to make a decision," she whispered carefully. "For everyone's sake." Then she handed Brandon the business card of a no-kill shelter 20 miles outside Seattle. Brandon barely slept after Vanessa handed him the shelter card. Long after midnight, He sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the small rectangle of paper while rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. Across the room, Max remained curled beside the hallway wall instead of his usual spot near Brandon's feet. The dog looked exhausted. Every few minutes his ears twitched toward the front door before lowering again. Brandon hated how distant they suddenly felt from each other. 5 years. Max had been the one constant in his life. Now Brandon found himself questioning every movement the dog made. Around 6 the next morning, Brandon woke to the sound of soft scraping near the kitchen cabinets. At first he thought Max was getting into trash again, but when he walked into the room, he stopped cold. Max had somehow dragged Vanessa's overnight bag halfway across the floor and was sitting beside it silently. The zipper had been pulled open just enough for several papers to spill onto the tile. "Max," Brandon groaned tiredly, rubbing his eyes. "What are you doing?" The dog did not react. He simply nudged one specific paper forward with his nose. Brandon bent down irritably, expecting another meaningless receipt or makeup product. Instead, he unfolded a printed document from the storage facility. At the top sat Vanessa's name along with a rental agreement for Unit 214. Brandon frowned immediately. The contract had started almost 3 months earlier. 3 months. That was weeks before Vanessa had officially moved into his apartment. Beneath the agreement sat another sheet partially hidden underneath it. Brandon pulled it free slowly. His stomach tightened. It was a copy of his apartment lease agreement, except several sections had been highlighted in yellow marker. Buyout clause, tenant transfer conditions, emergency contact authorization. Brandon stared at the highlighted pages in confusion. Why would Vanessa have copies of those sections specifically separated out inside a hidden storage unit file? Before he could think further, Max suddenly stood and walked backward several steps toward the hallway. Not nervous this time. Intentional. Almost like he was trying to pull Brandon somewhere. Brandon followed him quietly into the living room where Max stopped beside the bookshelf near the television stand. The dog pressed his paw against the bottom cabinet drawer once. Then again, Brandon slowly opened it. Inside were old chargers, batteries, manuals, and random junk they rarely touched. But tucked beneath a folded blanket sat a second phone Brandon had never seen before. His pulse quickened instantly. The device was powered off. No case. No wallpaper. Just a plain black phone hidden inside his apartment. Brandon heard the front door unlock suddenly and shoved the phone back into the drawer on instinct. Vanessa stepped inside carrying coffee cups and froze briefly when she noticed Brandon standing beside the open cabinet. "What are you doing?" she asked quickly. "Looking for batteries," Brandon answered after a pause. Vanessa stared at him for a second too long before forcing a small smile. "I brought your favorite." Max let out a soft, uneasy sound from behind Brandon, but did not approach her. For the rest of breakfast, Brandon barely touched his food. His mind kept replaying the hidden phone, the highlighted lease agreement, the secret storage unit, and the way Max had deliberately guided him to each one. The dog was not acting random. That realization settled into Brandon slowly and heavily. Somewhere beneath all the chaos, there was a pattern. And for the first time since all this started, Brandon stopped wondering whether Max was dangerous. Instead, he began wondering what exactly the dog was trying so desperately to protect him from. That afternoon, while Vanessa showered, Brandon quietly slipped the hidden phone into his jacket pocket and decided he was finally going to find out what was inside storage unit 214. The storage facility sat nearly 30 minutes outside Seattle beside an empty stretch of highway lined with chain-link fences and faded security lights. Brandon kept glancing toward the passenger seat during the drive where Max sat unusually still, his eyes fixed forward the entire time. The dog had not whimpered once since Brandon grabbed the hidden phone and left the apartment. It was almost as if Max already knew where they were going. By the time Brandon unlocked Unit 214, cold evening wind rattled the metal doors around the property. His hands shook slightly as he rolled the storage gate upward. At first, the unit looked ordinary. Plastic bins, cardboard boxes, a mattress leaning against the back wall. But then Brandon noticed something strange. Nearly every box had his name written on it in black marker. Brandon stepped inside slowly. One box contained framed photos taken from his apartment walls. Another held copies of his pay stubs, bank statements, and old tax records. His chest tightened harder with every item he uncovered. This was not storage. It was preparation. Max suddenly walked past Brandon and stopped beside a locked gray filing cabinet shoved beneath a tarp. The dog pawed at it once before sitting down quietly. Brandon stared at the cabinet uneasily. Then he remembered the hidden phone in his jacket pocket. His pulse spiked. After powering it on, the screen lit up instantly without a password. Messages began flooding the notification bar one after another. Brandon opened the newest thread first. His stomach dropped. The conversation was between Vanessa and a man named Kyle. Weeks of messages filled the screen. Discussions about apartment listings, Brandon's work schedule, his savings account, even jokes about how emotionally attached he was to Max. One message made Brandon physically step backward. Once the dog is gone, everything gets easier. His breathing became shallow. He kept scrolling. Then came the message that shattered everything. Kyle had been living in apartment 3B the entire time. Leonard was not an old neighbor. Leonard was Kyle's father. Brandon suddenly remembered the strange key, the nervous looks, the late-night jingling in the hallway, and Max barking outside apartment 3B like he was trying to stop something. The dog had not been acting irrational. He had recognized Kyle's scent coming from Leonard's apartment before Brandon ever knew the truth. Max had been trying to warn him for weeks. Brandon looked down at the dog in stunned silence while realization crashed over him piece by piece. The storage unit, the highlighted lease clauses, the hidden phone. Vanessa had been quietly preparing to move Brandon out of his own apartment after transferring the lease into her name with Kyle's help. Brandon opened another folder inside the cabinet and felt his knees nearly give out. Inside sat printed adoption forms from a dog relocation program dated 3 weeks earlier. Max's photo was attached to the paperwork. Vanessa had already arranged to send him away to another state. Brandon turned pale reading the final note clipped to the file. Owner emotionally dependent on animal. Removal recommended before transition. Max slowly walked closer and rested his head against Brandon's shaking hand. The same way he had done years ago inside that crowded shelter kennel. Brandon suddenly remembered every strange behavior from the past month in horrifying clarity. Max dragging the suitcase away from the door. Max scratching at the office where the key had been hidden. Max targeting the purse with the storage receipt inside. Max trying to pull Brandon toward the SUV behind the diner where Kyle had probably been waiting. None of it was random. The dog had been desperately trying to protect the only person he trusted while being treated like the problem the entire time. Brandon dropped heavily onto one of the storage boxes while Max leaned quietly against his leg. For several long seconds, Brandon could not even speak. He just stared at the adoption papers with tears slowly filling his eyes, realizing he had come terrifyingly close to abandoning the one soul that had never once betrayed him. Brandon sat inside the cold storage unit for what felt like hours while the hum of distant highway traffic echoed faintly through the metal walls. The adoption papers trembled in his hands. Across from him, Max stayed pressed quietly against his leg, not demanding attention, not barking, not whining, just staying close. That hurt Brandon more than anything else. The dog still trusted him. Even after everything, Brandon slowly lowered his head into his hands as memories began crashing into him one after another with sickening clarity. Max dragging Vanessa's suitcase away from the door that first night. Max trying to block the office where the hidden key had been discarded. Max pulling the storage receipt from the purse. Max barking outside apartment 3B because he recognized the scent connected to the man secretly planning behind Brandon's back. Every strange action suddenly transformed from chaos into desperate communication. And Brandon had ignored all of it. Worse than ignored it. He had punished the dog for trying to help him. Brandon swallowed hard as another memory surfaced. 3 nights earlier, after Vanessa handed him the shelter business card, Max had quietly brought Brandon his old baseball cap from the bedroom closet and laid it beside his feet. Brandon remembered shoving it absent-mindedly aside while arguing with Vanessa on the couch. But now he realized something devastating. Max always brought him that cap during panic attacks. Always. The dog had not been acting unstable that night. He had been trying to comfort Brandon while sensing something was wrong. Brandon looked down at Max with wet eyes. "You knew," he whispered shakily. "You were trying to tell me the whole time." Max lifted his head slightly at the sound of Brandon's voice, his tail giving one hesitant thump against the concrete floor. That tiny movement nearly broke Brandon completely. The dog still looked relieved just hearing kindness from him again. Brandon suddenly remembered the moment outside the diner when he had yelled at Max in the rain. The way the dog slowly lowered himself to the pavement afterward and refused to look him in the eyes. At the time, Brandon thought it was guilt. Now he understood it had been heartbreak. Max had probably believed he failed. Brandon pulled the dog into his arms so tightly that the folders slipped from his lap onto the floor. "I am so sorry," he said quietly into the golden fur around Max's neck. "I am so sorry, buddy." Max let out a deep breath and rested his head against Brandon's shoulder exactly the way he used to after Brandon's worst days at the shop. The same silent reassurance. The same loyalty. Brandon realized then that Max had never once acted out of fear for himself. Every strange behavior had been about protecting Brandon. Even the hidden phone. Even the storage unit. Even risking being sent away. The dog had kept trying anyway. Brandon wiped his eyes roughly and forced himself to stand. His sadness was slowly being replaced by something sharper now. Anger. Not at Max. At himself. At how close he had come to abandoning the one living creature that had stayed loyal through every broken part of his life. He looked around the storage unit one last time before gathering the evidence into a cardboard box. Then he picked up the adoption papers again and stared at Max's photograph clipped to the front. The image showed the dog sitting calmly with trusting eyes beneath the words "transfer approved." Brandon's jaw tightened instantly. "No," he said firmly. "Nobody is taking you anywhere." Max stood immediately, ears lifting for the first time in days. Brandon grabbed the hidden phone, the lease documents, and every printed message he could find before locking the storage unit behind him. As they walked back toward the truck beneath the freezing Seattle rain, Max stayed pressed close against Brandon's side. But just before Brandon opened the driver's door, his own phone suddenly buzzed inside his pocket. A new text message from Vanessa appeared on the screen. "Where are you? Call says he saw your truck near the highway." Brandon slowly looked down at Max in stunned silence. He had never told Vanessa about the storage unit. And somehow, she already knew where he had gone. Brandon did not drive back to the apartment that night. Instead, he took the highway north until the city lights disappeared behind endless rows of dark pine trees and quiet roadside diners glowing faintly in the rain. Around midnight, he pulled into a small lakeside motel outside Everett where fishermen usually stayed during the summer season. The old woman at the front desk barely looked up from her crossword puzzle when Brandon rented the room. But Max stayed pressed so tightly against Brandon's leg that she finally smiled softly and said, "Looks like he has had a rough week too." Brandon could not even answer. Inside the tiny motel room, everything smelled faintly of cedarwood and old coffee. Rain tapped gently against the windows, while an ancient floor heater hummed near the wall. Brandon set the cardboard evidence box onto the table and finally turned his phone completely off. For the first time in weeks, silence filled the room without tension hiding underneath it. Max stood uncertainly near the doorway at first, almost like he was waiting for another argument to begin. Brandon noticed something that made his chest ache instantly. The dog kept glancing toward the room's closet every few seconds, as if expecting to be shut away somewhere again. Brandon slowly walked over to the motel dresser and pulled out every extra blanket he could find. Then, instead of taking the bed for himself, he spread the blankets carefully across the carpet beside the heater vent where the warm air reached the strongest. Max watched him silently the entire time. Brandon disappeared briefly into the bathroom before returning with a damp washcloth and an unopened bottle of water from the mini fridge. Only now, under the soft yellow motel lights, did Brandon notice how exhausted Max truly looked. The fur around his eyes seemed dull from stress, and his paws were raw from scratching at doors and concrete floors for days trying to protect someone who kept misunderstanding him. Brandon lowered himself onto the carpet slowly beside the blanket pile and dipped the washcloth gently into warm water. "Come here, buddy," he whispered. Max hesitated at first. Then slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward and laid down beside Brandon for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Brandon carefully cleaned the dog's paws one at a time, while memories kept replaying painfully through his mind. Max carrying the baseball cap. Max sleeping near the apartment entrance every night like a guard standing watch. Max desperately trying to pull Brandon away from danger while still being called the problem. Brandon swallowed hard and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's shoulder. "You kept trying even after I stopped listening to you," he whispered quietly. Max responded by shifting closer until his body pressed fully against Brandon's side. It was such a small movement, but Brandon instantly realized what it meant. The dog finally felt safe enough to relax. A few minutes later, Brandon drove to a 24-hour grocery store and returned carrying a bag filled with fresh chicken, dog treats, and a cheap blue tennis ball from the pet aisle. Back at the motel, he cooked pieces of chicken slowly on the tiny kitchenette stove while Max watched from the blankets with cautious curiosity. When Brandon rolled the tennis ball lightly across the room afterward, Max stared at it in surprise for several seconds before finally standing up. The dog nudged the ball once with his nose. Then again, and for the first time in weeks, his tail began wagging naturally instead of nervously. Brandon felt tears sting his eyes again, but this time they felt different. Lighter somehow. Hopeful. Near sunrise, Brandon woke briefly to the sound of soft breathing beside him. Max had quietly climbed halfway onto the blankets during the night and fallen asleep with his head resting directly over Brandon's hand, as though he finally believed he would not be left behind after all. 3 months later, Brandon no longer took the highway home with a knot in his stomach. Life had become quieter in ways he never realized he needed. He transferred to a smaller repair shop near Everett where the owner let Max stay inside the garage office during long shifts. Customers started recognizing the golden retriever curled beside the front counter, and somehow the entire place felt warmer because of it. Mechanics who barely spoke to anyone would stop to scratch behind Max's ears before clocking in. One older customer even brought him tennis balls every Friday afternoon. Brandon still kept the blue motel ball inside his truck, though. It rested near the dashboard like a reminder of the night everything changed. The apartment in Seattle was gone now. Vanessa disappeared from Brandon's life almost immediately after he confronted her with the storage unit documents and hidden phone. There had been no screaming match, no dramatic scene, just silence. The kind of silence that comes when somebody realizes the truth finally arrived before their life finished unfolding. Brandon never saw Kyle again either. But strangely, none of that mattered much anymore. The anger faded faster than Brandon expected. What stayed with him instead was the memory of Max refusing to give up on him, even while being treated like a burden. Some nights Brandon still replayed those weeks in his head and felt sick remembering how close he came to abandoning the dog. He remembered the shelter card sitting on the kitchen table, the frustration in his own voice during the walk outside the diner, the way Max lowered himself onto the wet pavement after being yelled at. Every memory carried a different meaning now. One rainy Sunday morning, Brandon finally drove back to Seattle for the first time since leaving. Not to revisit the apartment, not to reopen old wounds. He drove there because he wanted to do something he should have done long ago. The Tacoma shelter where he first adopted Max still stood exactly the same, squeezed between a tire shop and a faded laundromat near the edge of town. The same barking echoed through the hallways. The same scent of disinfectant and old blankets filled the air. A young volunteer behind the desk smiled politely until Brandon placed a donation envelope on the counter thick enough to make her eyes widen. "This is for the dogs nobody wants," Brandon said quietly. "The nervous ones. The ones people misunderstand." Max stood calmly beside him the entire time with his tail brushing softly against Brandon's jeans. As Brandon walked through the kennel hallway afterward, dozens of dogs barked excitedly behind metal gates hoping for attention. But one small shepherd mix stayed hidden silently in the back corner of her kennel trembling beside an overturned water bowl. Brandon stopped immediately. So did Max. The golden retriever walked slowly toward the kennel door and lowered himself onto the floor without making a sound. The frightened dog stared at him cautiously for several long seconds before inching forward little by little until her nose finally touched the gate near Max's paw. Brandon felt his throat tighten instantly. Even here, after everything, Max was still trying to make another scared animal feel safe. The shelter volunteer smiled softly behind him. "She has not gone near anyone in days," she whispered. Brandon looked down at Max quietly. The dog glanced back at him with calm, familiar eyes that no longer carried fear or anxiety. Only trust, pure and steady. Brandon knelt beside him and gently rubbed the fur behind his ears while sunlight filtered weakly through the shelter windows above them. For the first time in a very long time, everything felt still, really still, and Brandon finally understood something that would stay with him forever. Sometimes the soul trying hardest to save you is the one you almost leave behind.